December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. Even as Japanese diplomats were conferring with Secretary of State Hull on peace measures, Nipponese planes were swooping down on Pearl Harbor. This pictorial record includes both U.S. films and pictures made by the enemy as they dropped their load of death on the naval base, on Wheeler Field, on civilian homes and schools. 100 Japanese planes and a number of midget submarines took part in the attack. In an hour and 5 minutes, the battleship Arizona was completely destroyed and 4 others severely damaged.
Road to War in Asia goes back to when Japanese imperial ambitions rose in the 1920s and 1930s. Why did Japan begin World War II by invading China in 1937 and then widen it by attacking the British and Americans in 1941? Were these attacks the outgrowth of a Japanese state with a uniquely intense nationalism, or of a particularly coercive social order, or of economic and social inequalities? Or had Japan by the late 1930s entered a stage of late capitalist development that naturally segued into fascism? Was there a direct causal connection between the West's forces' intrusion into Japan in the 1850s and subsequent Western pressure on Japan and its neighbors and the launching of Japan's World War II in Asia in 1937? The road to war in Asia holds all the mysteries behind the most destructive war the world had ever known.
Pearl Harbor is located in Hawaii, which was bombed by the Japanese military during World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor stemmed from intensifying Japanese and American rivalry in the Pacific Ocean. Japan's imperial ambitions have been evident from as early as 1931, when the Japanese military invaded Manchuria. In 1931, the Japanese military units seized control of Manchuria. Japan had acquired influence in Manchuria after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905. Japan referred to Manchuria as Manchukuo, which remained a puppet state until the end of the Second World War.
Americans' opinion of Japan in the 1930s saw Japan as a threat to economic interests and saw them as oppressive and aggressive. With this hostility in mind, Japan saw that alternatives for their country included acceptance of American terms, which they feared would bring them down to a second or third ranked power, or war with no certain outcome. They saw no choice but war.
In 1937, a major attack on the Chinese heartland started World War II in Asia. At the time, much of the world perceived Japan in a negative light, which then resulted in Japan feeling isolated from and threatened by other major world powers. In the United States, anti-Japanese immigration policies convinced some Japanese that European racism prevented Western countries from acknowledging Japan as an equal power. At the time, Japan was heavily dependent on foreign imports like oil and metals, especially from the United States. The U.S. became more hostile towards Japanese aspirations in Asia, resulting in Japan's resources being controlled by the Western powers.
World War II had been raging in Europe and Asia for 2 years, but the United States had not entered the war. The Empire of Japan was trying to take over much of Asia and was worried about the U.S. Navy in Hawaii. They decided to strike Pearl Harbor in order to prevent the United States from attacking them. The conflict in this region was mainly due to different countries who controlled the small territories and islands in the Pacific Ocean.
During the time of World War II, Hawaii was not a state, but a U.S. territory. The conquered region's abundant resources were then used to supply Japan's war machine. The Japanese thought that if they took out the warships in Pearl Harbor, then the United States Navy would be crippled and would never attack. However, they were mistaken, and the attack on Pearl Harbor had just the opposite result.
The Japanese had hoped to break the Americans by attacking Pearl Harbor, but instead they united them. The U.S. declared war the next day. Although Japan bombed many U.S. military aircrafts and ships, the U.S. military was not too crippled by the attack. Western criticism led Japan to withdraw from the League of Nations, and by 1936, Japan was more closely aligned with Germany and Italy, who declared war on the United States 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the United States was a major part of World War II.
Japan had come to know the stalwart that were the Americans by declaring war. Following the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the United States had fought fire with fire and bombed the Japanese right back. Japan had found the dead end in the road to war in Asia.